Well, you are now watching live coverage of the total collapse of the Elon Musk-Donald Trump partnership in governing in the House of Representatives tonight. Elon Musk and Donald Trump took over the leadership of the Republican House of Representatives, the leadership in that building, in the last 24 hours, and negotiated what Donald Trump falsely called a deal. The problem was they were negotiating with themselves. In Congress, a deal is compromise legislation that creates enough votes, and you know ahead of time that it creates enough votes, to pass a bill through the House and then pass it through the Senate with enough votes, and then with the agreement that it will be signed by the president. That's a deal. In Congress, every deal is a three-way deal involving enough votes to pass the House, enough votes to pass the Senate, with a bill that the president has already agreed to sign. That's what a deal is. It was impossible for Donald Trump and Elon Musk to make a deal without negotiating with Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, and President Biden. There is no deal in Washington now without President Biden's signature. Something Elon Musk apparently doesn't know. But still, Donald Trump said, quote, Speaker Mike Johnson and the House have come to a very good deal for the American people. That's what he said earlier today. Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson obviously realizing that both Elon Musk and Donald Trump are legislatively insane, decided to let the insane and impossible Musk-Trump bill come to a vote in the House tonight.
This is Washington. This is how the lawmaking is done. It's a long process. Sometimes it takes a while to reach consensus, but we're going to do the right thing here tonight.
No. That was not how lawmaking was done. Mike Johnson knew when he was saying that the legislatively insane Musk-Trump bill was going to fail spectacularly when the House voted a few minutes later. After a relentless 24 hours of pressure from Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, who is obviously the richest person in the history of Republican politics, 36 Republican members of the House, 38 Republican members of the House of Representatives said no to Elon Musk. 38 Republican members of the House said no to Donald Trump. After having their political futures threatened by both Donald Trump and Elon Musk, Trump and Musk said that anyone who voted against this deal should be knocked out of office in the next election. They threatened the political lives of those 38 members of the House. Donald Trump threatened Republicans who didn't vote for this bill today, saying they, quote, should be primaried and disposed of as quickly as possible. Donald Trump has never been more directly and personally threatening to Republicans than he was today, and Donald Trump lost. Donald Trump's threats meant nothing to 38 Republican members of the House. Elon Musk's threats and his billions meant nothing to 38 Republican members of the House. So far, Elon Musk has failed at every public lobbying attempt he has made since the presidential election. Elon Musk told Republican senators who they must vote for majority leader next year, and Republican senators said no. Elon Musk candidate came in third in the election for the Republican majority leader of the Senate next year. Elon Musk's support meant nothing to Republican senators. Elon Musk was part of the group that hatched the brilliant idea of having Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Elon Musk lobbied publicly for Matt Gaetz to be confirmed as Attorney General. Elon Musk lost badly in that lobbying effort. And then yesterday, Elon Musk decided to tell the Republican Speaker of the House and the Republican members of the House of Representatives that the bill that they negotiated to pass the House, pass the Senate, and be signed by President Biden was no good. And so Speaker Johnson, in effect today, said to Elon Musk and Donald Trump, go ahead, show us how to do it. And Elon Musk got crushed on the House floor by Republicans, 38 Republicans on the House floor, crushed and humiliated Elon Musk and Donald Trump at the same time. Republican speakers of the House in the 21st century have repeatedly had to deal with some of the most ignorant and irreversibly stupid members of the House of Representatives in history. None more ignorant or more irreversibly stupid about legislating than Elon Musk, who in the last 24 hours has proved himself to be even stupider than Donald Trump about how the House of Representatives works, how the Senate works, how the presidency works. In other words, how a bill becomes a law. Elon Musk didn't learn that in his South African elementary school like the rest of us did in the United States in elementary school or high school at the latest. They didn't have that little song about how a bill becomes a law in Elon Musk's South African private school. Here is just one of the 38 Republicans who Elon Musk and Donald Trump promised to destroy today for voting against their bill.
It's embarrassing. It's shameful. Yes, I think this bill is better than it was yesterday on certain respects, but to take this bill yesterday and congratulate yourself because it's shorter in pages but increases the debt by $5 trillion is asinine. And that's precisely what Republicans are doing.
Does he sound afraid of Elon Musk? Does he sound afraid of Donald Trump? That's Chip Roy of Texas. Before the vote today, Donald Trump said this about Chip Roy. Chip Roy is just another ambitious guy with no talent. By the way, how's Bob Good doing? I hope some talented challengers are getting ready in the great state of Texas to go after Chip in the primary. He won't have a chance. After Donald Trump's ultimate threat against Chip Roy and Bob Good, they were both among the 38 Republicans who voted against Donald Trump and voted against Elon Musk after they both issued the ultimate threat they could possibly issue to a politician: we will kill your political career. They cast that vote against Donald Trump in the face of the most extreme threat he has ever issued to members of the House of Representatives. It is extremely unlikely, even at this stage, at this hour, of Elon Musk's spectacular failure as a legislator, that he knows there is only one person in the United States Senate who can bring a bill to a vote in the Senate. Of course he doesn't know that. Senator Chuck Schumer said in a statement, quote, "It's a good thing the bill failed in the House. Now it's time to go back to the bipartisan agreement we came to." That's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the only person who can bring a bill to a vote in the United States Senate. You don't have to have a deal if the Majority Leader of the United States Senate has not agreed to bring your bill up to a vote and vote for it. So even if, at the last minute, those 38 Republicans decided that they really were too afraid of Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and they voted to pass the Musk-Trump bill, it would have passed the House of Representatives, and then it would have died. It would have gone to the United States Senate. The phrase for that kind of bill arriving in the Senate is dead on arrival. But Republicans in the House killed the Musk-Trump bill without Chuck Schumer having to even look at it. It is impossible to overstate how colossal a failure this is for Donald Trump, who is a lame duck now every day for the next 4 years. He's a lame duck. He can never run again. And for Elon Musk, who embarked on his first legislative adventure and could not have failed more spectacularly. And this is very good news for America. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are not in charge of legislating in Congress. 38 Republicans think what Donald Trump and Elon Musk want to do is insane. Asinine is actually one of the words that was used on the floor today by Republican Chip Roy. The weakness of Donald Trump in the Republican House of Representatives has now been fully exposed, and we have never seen anything like it. in an incoming president with his own party. And the weakness and legislative stupidity of Elon Musk has now been fully exposed to all Republicans who all know how badly Elon Musk lost today. And enough Republicans are not afraid of either Donald Trump or Elon Musk, even when facing the most extreme threats Donald Trump and Elon Musk have ever aimed at politicians. Obviously, Democrats in the House did not vote for a bill that Elon Musk and Donald Trump negotiated among themselves without speaking to a single Democrat about it. The Democratic leader of the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, said this before the vote that crushed the Musk-Trump bill.
We reached a bipartisan agreement to be there for farmers and families, children, seniors, working class Americans all across the country. The men and women who serve this country in uniform and are veterans. House Republicans have abandoned that bipartisan agreement that we entered into in good faith. A bill that House Republicans negotiated gave us your word that we were going to move forward together on behalf of the American people. It was a Republican drafted bill that was posted by House Republicans. And then one or two puppet masters weigh in, and the extreme MAGA Republicans decide to do the bidding of the wealthy, the well-off, the well-connected, millionaires and billionaires, not working-class people all across America.
One of the changes Elon Musk and Donald Trump made to the bill was to eliminate support of research on children's cancer. And Donald Trump, at the last minute, decided he wanted to add a dramatic increase in the debt ceiling, an unprecedented increase in the debt ceiling, to the bill, even though the government won't come close to reaching its debt limit until June. Donald Trump actually wants to pass a bill that will completely suspend the debt ceiling, just totally eliminate it. There is no debt limit for the United States for 2 years, so that Donald Trump can run up the debt to any level at all with his tax cuts for billionaires like Elon Musk.
The provisions in this bill, particularly as it relates to suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years, are designed to bring about a massive tax cut, unpaid for wealthy donors and for wealthy corporations, for millionaires and billionaires who clearly some in this Congress are working for. And this bill is validation for it. Now, what's been interesting to me is that for decades, the Republican Party has lectured America about fiscal responsibility, about the debt and the deficit. It's always been phony. This bill proves it. The one thing we do know is that every time a Republican president comes into office, the one thing we can count on Republicans to do is to pass a massive tax cut for wealthy Americans, and in the process, stick working-class Americans with the bill by raising the deficit and the debt. The phoniness in claiming that extreme MAGA Republicans are about working-class Americans or the party of fiscal responsibility, nothing could be further from the truth. When you run up the debt and the deficit, middle-class families pay, working-class families pay, and we are going to defend them.